In this video, I'll show you how to write automated Apex tests for your Salesforce flows. We'll start off with the simple client intake flow that I've introduced in other videos, and I'll show you how to trigger the flow by creating an instance of the custom client intake object, and then make assertions or validate that the contact is created on the back end. So first off, we have here the client intake flow project. Now, this is in a GitHub repository on my account. I will put a link in the video description so you can follow along to this if you want. But right now, I've already cloned that repo to my local computer, and I have Visual Studio Code open to those files. So here's the flow that we'll be working with. Here's the file that represents the metadata for that flow. So what I want to do first is open up our org that has the flow running, or the flow installed or deployed to it. So what I'll do is I'll say SFDX, nope, the extensions haven't run yet. So what I'll do here is go to the terminal window, and I'll say SFDX force org list. And one of my orgs that I already have authorized in my CLI is called client intake. That's where my flow is right there. So I'll say SFDX force org open, and we'll give it the alias of the client intake. That'll open up a browser window to our client intake org. Oh, I always do that. It's not A in this case, it's U. So that will open up the client intake org that has our flow already deployed. And that pops up a window right here. And let's go look at the flow to remind ourselves what this flow is doing, because it's important for this. So go down to flows. And here we can see our client intake flow is right there. And this flow triggers on the creation of our client intake custom object. And then as soon as that's triggered, it simply creates a new contact record. So if I open this up, I can see that it creates a new contact record, and it populates the email and the last name fields. And it also takes the ID of the client intake record and puts it into a custom field on the contact object. So we want to validate all three of those things in our test. So keep that in mind. So I'm going to close this out, minimize this window. And the first thing we need to do is, well, for one, since we're working with a GitHub repository, we're going to want to create a branch. So let me go to source control, and I can do it here with the branch, create branch, which these extensions, these SFDX extensions, Visual Studio Code are slow for the first bit. Okay, we're going to call this Apex tests. So now, instead of main down here, we have creating a feature branch for our changes so that when I push them up to my GitHub repository, I can make a pull request and protect my main branch. If you aren't using GitHub or Git at all, you can just ignore all of this when it comes to creating your Apex tests. Okay, so now the interesting stuff. So we want to test this flow. First thing we have to do is create an Apex class. So to create an Apex class, go to your command palette, which is Control-Shift-P, and say create Apex class. You can type in, you can see it's at the top of mine, but you can type in the word class and it'll filter to the top. So we'll create an Apex class, and we'll say client intake flow tests. That'll be the name of our class. And we'll put it into the default directory, the default classes directory, because our project has no other Apex classes. In a bigger project, I'd be tempted to make a test directory to organize my tests separate from my classes that do things like modify, business process and things like that. But in this case, we only have one class in our entire project. So I'm just going to pick the default. And you can see that created a class right here. And so we just have a standard Apex class right there. So in order to make this a test class, we use this attribute at the top of the class called isTest. And I'll delete this constructor because we're not going to use constructor in this. And now we need to create a method or a function, depending on what nomenclature you use, to represent a test. So we're going to say public static void flow creates contact. Now we have a function, but we also need to decorate this with the isTest attributes so that Salesforce knows this is a test to run. So if I save this at this point, and I can right click in this file, as long as you're running against a DevHub org, you can right click in this file and say, deploy this source to org. If you're working on a Scratch org, you may have to do it through the manifest file. But I'd recommend to start off with doing the dev org because you have more options. Okay, so we've deployed this class to our org. And now if we go to our test icon over here, testing icon, click on that, it says no Apex test found. But if we go to this refresh button, we can now see that we have the client intake flow test. So this is test marks the class. That shows up here. And under that class, every function or method that we have decorated with the isTest shows up as a test. So if I run this, the test will pass because nothing's going wrong. So as long as you get to the end of the function or the end of the method with nothing going wrong, the test will pass. Now, if we want the test to fail, we can put in an assertion that fails. So assertions work like this. So you say assert dot r, I guess it is true. And then we'll say false. And put a message in here that says false is not true. So we're asserting that the value false is true. So if false is not true, which it's not, it will throw an error and fail the test. So if we deploy this class, deploy success, completed success. I can't wait to say the word success. The deploy completed successfully. Now we can run the test again. And now it should fail because our assertion didn't pass. And if we hover over this failed test, you can see it says system.assert exception, assertion failed, with our message that says false is not true. So this is a nice way to let someone know not only that your test failed, but why it failed. So that message tells you why the assertion is important or what it's trying to assert. Okay, great. So now we know how to make a test fail, but we need to know how can we write this test in a way that asserts that when the flow runs, okay, for one thing, we want to assert that the flow is running. We want to assert that a contact record is created when that flow runs. And we want to assert that the two fields on the contact record get populated with the right values. So the first thing we need to do, we know that our flow is triggered to run on the creation of our client intake custom object. So the first thing we need to do is create a client intake custom object. So we'll say client intake _C. And in our files here, we have all of these things defined. So in our objects, we can go to client intake and you can see that our custom object is defined there. So we have the name of the object and then the API names of the fields that are available. So I can say client intake equals new client _intake _C. So I'll create a new instance of it, and we need to set the properties of it, or set the fields if you want to think of it that way. Client intake dot email _C, and we'll give it it doesn't matter what value you give it as long as it's a proper email. So we can say some client@example.com. And then we also need to set the default name field because we're mapping that to the last name field of the contact record. So if I say client intake name equals some. Okay, so those are the two fields that those are two of the three fields we populate on the contact record. The other one will be the ID generated by the client intake custom object when we create it, but that gets created automatically. So now that we have an instance of the class, we actually need to insert it to the database. So if we say insert client intake, that tells Salesforce to create a client intake record. Now, the great thing about Apex tests is that once you create the record, when the test finishes, that record is rolled back. It doesn't exist in the database after the test runs. It will only exist within this test, which is great. So we can create records willy-nilly and they just get rolled back, or you can think of it just never being fully committed to the database, but we can still act like it was. So very, very nice. So at this point, we've inserted a client intake record, which should trigger our flow. So the easiest way for us to see if our flow actually ran and created an object or created a contact record would be to query the database and see if a contact was created. So let's see what we have when we try to pull all the contacts. So we say list contacts equals, and we're going to do a select statement here. So write a little bit of SOQL. Select ID from contact. Now, the cool thing about these Apex tests is that even though I don't have a where clause in my SOQL, I'm only going to pull the records that were created as part of this test. So if my client intake flow created a contact record in the context of this test, that's the only contact I have access to in the test. So I can just freely select all the contacts, and this should only have one contact record. And that will be our first assertion, to make sure that only one contact record, or one and only one contact record, was created. So if we say assert r equal, we put the first value is what we expect, which is expect there to be 1, and the second value is what we're testing. So we're going to say contacts.size. And if this fails, this is the message we want to show. And we'll say we expected one contact record. Okay, so let's go delete this assertion that will always fail. So now we're going to run the test, which will create an instance of this client intake custom object, which should trigger the flow, which should create a contact record, and we're testing to make sure that one and only one contact record was created. So let's deploy this class, deploy this source to org. And that ran successfully. Let's go back to our test tab. Let's run the test. And sure enough, it's green. So we are running the flow and we are creating a contact record. Now, to demonstrate what this looks like when it fails, I can say, all right, let's make sure there are two contact records created, which we know is not the intent of the flow. The flow only creates one contact record. So let's save that, deploy that source to org, and then we'll run the test again and show the error message. Actually, I'll change this too, just to make this more clear. We expect two contact records. Let's deploy that one more time. Okay, so now if we run this test, it should fail because our flow is in fact creating one contact record, and it does. And if we hover over, we can see it says we expected two contact records, expected to actual one. So we know that one contact record is being created every time we insert a client intake custom object. So great. But we can go further. We can also validate not only that we created a contact record, but that the right values are in the contact record. So let's explore how to do that. For one thing, let's change our test so it actually works again. So we expect one, expected one contact record to be created. We'll leave that just like that. So once the contact record is created, we know that there's one in there, right? So now we can say, we can create a variable with the one contact record we're dealing with. So I'll say contact equals contacts, and we'll just get the first one out of this collection, out of this list. Get 0. So I'll just pull the first one. And then we can write some assertions against this one contact record. So we can assert r equal, and we expect it to equal the values we put into client intake. So we can say client intake email as the expected value, and we can say contact.email as the value we're comparing against. And we'll say the contact record does not have the same email. Now I'll save that, deploy. It's going to take just a second. There we go. And then if we run this, it'll give us an error. And I did this on purpose to show you something that happens all the time. So this error says S-object row was retrieved via SOQL without requiring the requested field contact email. So we're referencing the client intake, we're referencing the email from the contact, but we did not put it in the select list here when we grabbed all the contacts. So we're going to need to add not only the email field, but also the name field that the last name field that we use. So let's do that right now. We're going to pull email and last name from the contact record. Oh, and we're also going to validate we'll do that later. We'll focus on this right now. Okay, so we're going to go assert. Oh, let's make sure we fixed our error first. So let's go save that. And if I deploy the code again, great, that ran successfully. Run the test one more time. Okay, so that worked. The email from the client intake is being put into the email field of the contact record. So just to be thorough, let's flesh out the rest of this test and say, make sure that the name field is getting set properly, or the last name field in the contact is getting set properly. So we'll say client intake name is the expected value, and we're going to check the contact record last name field. Last name field was not set properly. And then there's one more, and that is to make sure that we are linking the contact record, newly created contact record, with the client intake record that triggered its creation. So let's say r equal, and we'll say client intake ID equals contact dot, and we don't have the IntelliSense on that. So let's go look and see what the name of the field is, and we have it in here on the contact record, client intake underscore double underscore C. So if I say client intake double underscore C, and the contact record, this fails, contact record does not have the client intake ID. So that's a little long. A lot of times in tests, you're not going to see people writing these messages like this. I'm just being thorough. So we'll save that. And then remember, because we're going to reference this contact here, we have to add it to the select list here. So we'll say client. Oh, this is not right. I need the underscore. Client intake double underscore C. So now that we have all of that, we're validating all the fields. This is really all the flow does. So if this test runs, we know our flow does exactly what we intended for it to do. So we can deploy the source to org. And it successfully ran. Great. So let's run the test one more time. And it runs. So that's it. That's how you test a simple flow using Apex automated tests, which is pretty great. So just to wrap this up in a tidy little bow, because I want this this class to be available to everyone that's watching the YouTube video on GitHub, let's go ahead and push this up to GitHub. And let's commit it. And we'll say added an Apex test for the client intake flow. Great. Oh, we got to add these files to it first. Okay. And we'll commit that. And now we're going to publish this branch to GitHub. All right, I won't go through the pull request merge process. I have another video about that, but that's everything. Thank you for watching.